Okay, hi everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this event. My name is Drew Dalton and I am the chair of trustees at ReportOUT. I want to wish you all a warm welcome to our event. The recording can be found later on our YouTube channel, and so we keep recording of all of our events so people may watch them later. For your information, ReportOUT are a global human rights organization for sexual and gender minorities. We're based in the United Kingdom, in the northeast of the United Kingdom. And what we do is we research, monitor, and we record human rights abuses against sexual and gender minorities in every single nation state. At the moment, we're focusing in particular on Morocco, Ethiopia, Belize, and Mongolia, and have previously completed work in Uganda and in Zimbabwe. We use this work to then educate people and campaign about human rights abuses of people. We are entirely volunteer-led. We have a team of over 50 volunteers who help us to do this work, and we're just a wee small little charity. But for further details, please do check out our website at www.reportout.org. We also have a range of previous events on YouTube for you to watch, with discussion panelists from nation states such as Mongolia, Ghana, Russia, and the Cayman Islands. But we also have wider regional area talks, such as South Asia, and historical talks for things like LGBT history month. Talking about the men with the pink triangle in Nazi Germany. I'll send a link to our YouTube channel in a moment. Please do subscribe. You're always welcome to subscribe us. We've launched it the past few months. You're highly welcome to check us out. So if you want to sign up to our event sooner than most people, please do sign up to our email list, which has exclusive events coming up. We offer free training courses and opportunities for you to get involved. Volunteering with us, of which we'll be doing a volunteer recruitment drive in around about February 2022, which is a little bit exciting. The link can be found on our website, and I'll drop it in the chat box as we here tonight. We'll also drop a donation link at random intervals. We are entirely volunteer-led, and small charities, particularly people working at a global level with LGBT rights. It tends to be not particularly well funded, so if anyone would like to drop a donation, feel free, and that will go directly to the work that we do. So anyway, I would like to now hand over to David France. We're doing a little bit of a Q&A style interview, and I'm personally a little bit of a hero. I'm not going to lie. I really like what you do, so I've been really excited about this. And so, David, please, hi, lovely to meet you. Please tell us just a little bit about you, please.
Well, hi, Drew, and it's great to meet you, and great to learn of all of your work, which is pretty amazing and ongoing and so important. I am a longtime journalist. I got my start in journalism in the early 1980s. And I was called to journalism by the AIDS pandemic. It was what I felt I could do to contribute, was to try and find information and try to disseminate that information. And so for most of these years, I've been covering health issues, certainly the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which is an ongoing issue globally. Has remained one of the focus of part of my work over all these years. I've also reported a lot on the LGBTQ movement, and from the early 80s when it had gained such little traction really globally, to today, which has been a really remarkable couple of decades in which our place in civic life, I guess, is how you would put it, has been totally transformed and radicalized, and that's been an amazing thing to chronicle. So that's been really the kind of the arc of my interests in storytelling and journalism, and only more recently filmmaking.
Brilliant. So what is that then fire that burns inside of you then?
Well, it's I have felt compelled to tell stories about people whose stories were not being told in other ways. I started working in the queer presses because it was not possible to tell queer stories to a larger audience. And once we kind of broke through that barrier, I have tried to make it my business to tell the stories of people who were still being left out, whose stories were still going untold, and to try to find in those stories the kind of universality of them. And often, I guess I found myself focusing on activism and the way activism and activists have changed so much about the world that the younger generations are inheriting, really forged by people who are outsiders, who are kind of visionary activists who have been able to find a way to power and to use that power for good. And I guess those are the stories that really attract my attention.
Brilliant. And I can imagine in the early days, as you said, when you first approached journalism, a lot of the kind of queer voices would have been largely stamped out of a lot of main media. Am I right in saying?
Absolutely. That, in fact, while mainstream media was reporting on the queer community, it was always with derision or hostility or focused on crimes or scientific oddities. There were exclamation points all across any piece of journalism that focused on our lives, and so it was really the counterbalance was found only in the alternative presses, and ultimately we those of us who were writing there basically just kind of stormed into the mainstream outlets and took them over ultimately, and just made them stop. I think that there's certainly in this country and probably in yours as well, there's a lot of atonement that could be made coming from media portrayals of our community over those decades.
I quite agree, and I think it's largely unaddressed as well.
Yeah.
We certainly have some newspapers in particular who had an image of what we're supposed to be like and reported it in a very particular way. Mm-hmm. Especially going back to my memories of the 1980s anyway, and 90s and still onwards. So this is...
Yeah, it's not over, but no. It's at least...
I know you talked about obviously your filmmaking, and one that springs to mind immediately is the life and death of Martha P. Johnson. For those people who are new to this in the room, could you just explain who Martha was and a little bit about their life, please?
No, absolutely. She was certainly a fixture in the Village when in New York when I moved to New York. She was known to have been a key participant in the Stonewall Uprising of 1969. There's so much mythology about that event or those events. It was an uprising that went on for several days. Sometimes Marcia is described as the instigator. There are various apocryphal stories about what she did that night. But what we know she didn't start it. She told an interviewer in a long lost piece of audio tape that the conflagration was already in full swing by the time she arrived there at about 2 a.m. But the eyewitnesses do talk about the key kind of combatant role that she played once she did arrive there, and she was a fierce. She was fiercely engaged in battle with the cops. Which is what everybody was doing that night, and she was helping the injured, and she was, she was just an important figure. She was homeless most of the time, and she still managed to have this kind of reputation within the community. She always dressed flamboyantly. And then after the insurrection in the Village, she was one of a handful of people that started meeting on a regular basis to build the the foundation really for the modern LGBT movement. She helped found the Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activist Alliance. She was a member of those committees that was working on establishing strategies for the movement. She helped organize the first Gay Pride march the following year to commemorate the first anniversary of Stonewall. And so in that way, she's really kind of, one of the founders of the movement that we have today. She also might have considered herself transgender, if that word had been around. She used both male and female pronouns. She only ever called herself Marcia, and she only ever dressed in women's clothing. And she died in 1992 mysteriously, and that was, just at the beginning of what we can kind of understand as being the gender identity revolutions that have happened in the last couple of decades. But in a really important way, she launched that as well. She started the first trans rights organization, if it could be called that. It was called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And that really was the very first of those organizations. It lasted for just a few short years, but in a way, she was conceiving of this kind of future for our community that we all have, followed to find her vision for.
Brilliant. And I remember watching this because everybody, it's still on Netflix. Do watch it. This is a fantastic documentary series. I remember watching it, and I remember her friend, now the name has gone out the top of my head, who was living in the dock area.
Sylvia Rivera. Yeah.
Thank you. And I remember being quite dismayed at that, considering they were part of the foundation of the Stonewall movement and so on, and movement from that. And then to end up living homeless, like Marcia did for most of her life, living homeless and living in a kind of Dockland area of New York, wasn't it?
Yeah, right.
And it was a little bit of there was a kind of a bittersweet tragedy to that in a sense. But no, it was an absolutely brilliant piece. And so I think I think very often we have these hidden voices and this concept of hidden voices, don't we? And we have this as a group.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and their voices were suppressed, really, and they really leaned on each other. Sylvia and Marcia did. They were, kind of two sides of the coin that was pushing us forward on this question of gender and gender identity, and also diversity within the community, that it was not and shouldn't be seen as a community or movement of affluent white gay men, that it needed to have the edges of it pulled out and stretched, and they did that to a great detriment to themselves. And you see that in the film. They suffered in their efforts to try to remain part of the community and the movement over all those years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at that point as well, when the feminist movement was obviously beginning to see the fractures and ruptures of the feminist movement for transgender rights and identities, all of those things started to emerge from that point, which we're seeing the result of today, really, in many senses, aren't we?
Yeah.
But yeah, fantastic. And so when you so let's move on, if we may, a little bit, just keeping to time. What actually inspired you to write the book How to Survive a Plague, and then obviously film it? What was the inspiration?
Well, I had started looking back at those AIDS years, those plague years, as I call them, the period of time between the first discovery of HIV in 1981 and 15 years later, when finally medications were developed that had a true impact on HIV and made HIV infections, into basically chronic conditions and not almost certain death sentences, which is as they had been. So in that 15-year period, there was a period of mass death, a period of great and concentrated tragedies. And I had, as I said, worked as a journalist covering much of that pandemic from a scientific perspective. I wanted to look back at those years and see what lessons could be derived from them. And I began as a print journalist. My first thought was to work on a book on the subject. And it was another 15 years after that I started, so almost 30 years since the arrival of HIV. It was a period where people were not talking much about what had happened in the community. The assumption was that the stories had been told, and that it's just too unrelentingly sad that we should just move on from that time. But so much happened in those years as a result of the response, the community's response to the pandemic, that really kind of left an incredible legacy for everybody else. And that's what I wanted to look at, to try to gather, to be able to, hold it for future generations so that they could know what we did and what we saw. And it was, I started the book, but was not able to get a publisher for it initially because they really didn't want to hear another story about AIDS.
Wow.
We had Angels in America. And the band played on. They felt that the canonical works were already out, and I knew that was wrong. But I couldn't convince anybody in publishing. Although I had written a number of books already, really, literally nobody wanted it. So that's why what caused me to turn to documentary filmmaking. I had been looking at some of that old archival footage in my research for the book. And I thought it was, interestingly, the first movement that chronicled itself so thoroughly as that. The camcorder became a tool of AIDS activists right from the start. So there was so much that had been recorded. And so I turned to that footage and worked for a number of years to craft that footage into a small story that captured some of that work over those 15 years. And that's the film, How to Survive a Plague. And once that film found and proved that there was an audience for this greater story about activism, citizen science activism, and how it transformed medicine, really, not just science and pharmacology, but all of medicine across the globe. And so I was invited finally to return and finish the book, which I did do, also called How to Survive a Plague.
And brilliant. And I'm so pleased that worked out as well. And I'm quite surprised that I'm not surprised because myself, I've worked in the HIV sector for a lot of years, and I very much understand how these stories get overlooked or are seen as saturating the things that are out there already almost. Mm-hmm. So what are your standout moments from that? And both writing the book and both making the film?
I think the biggest thing that struck me is how many people have been touched by AIDS. And I would meet people in screenings of a film, which is screened regularly on college campuses now, who are digging into their own family history and discovering that their uncle had died of AIDS, for example, and that they knew nothing about what happened to their uncle, or what was their uncle's life like, that life, the story of that life had been removed from the family. And there's this generation of people who are trying to look back and retrieve their own connections to relatives who may have just been thrown away by their families, who may have died all alone in exile from their biological families, and instead only with the support of their community. But who was their community? And that's what people are interested in finding out. Like, did they have partners? Did they have friends? How could we understand their life even after their own siblings and direct relatives had tried to erase it from their narrative? And that's been really interesting. And watching those generations of people trying to heal their families in that way.
Oh, and then amongst this, we've also got the kind of that tension between the activists and medicine and science as well here. Could you tell us just a little bit more about that, please, just for people who don't know about it?
Well, but when HIV first hit, we were still operating in a kind of a paternalistic, expert-controlled medical environment where patients were considered only the recipients of healthcare, not at all partners in their own healthcare. And with HIV, because people were dying so quickly, the community first started taking on its own medical issues. They created these underground pharmacies where you could buy smuggled drugs from other countries that weren't available here. It was all experimental. There was nothing really that worked. So these underground buyers clubs, they were called, specialized in what they called what the hell drugs, like drugs that wouldn't hurt you or wouldn't hurt you any more than you're already being hurt. So why not give them a try? And after a while, in this kind of parallel universe that was established, which included parallel scientific journals and parallel research tracks and parallel drug distribution networks, the community realized that wasn't going to save anybody's life. That what had to happen was that the real and existing centers of scientific research and power had to be brought into this fight, and they had to be made to do it. They had to be forced to do it in ways that were ethical, moral, nimble, and took into account the fact that the people who were coming to them were the only real experts in what HIV disease was, because they had experienced it as a community for such a long period of time. And what ultimately happened, and this is one of the real fundamental contributions of AIDS activism, is that AIDS activists demanded a voice in every aspect of research around their disease, including at pharmaceutical companies, including in clinical trials, including in conferences for scientists and researchers, including in government bodies that were regulating how much money and were regulating the release of drugs. And they forced their way in. That's what the film and the book are really about, is how, for the first time ever, patients became full partners in every aspect of their disease state and treatment, and how it revolutionized, how it saved lives, and then how it's revolutionized all aspects of science now. Every disease state, from breast cancer to autism, has representatives of those communities on official community engagement boards that take a role, a direct role in every aspect of the whole industry around their disease. It'll never be the same, and that's thanks to AIDS.
Quite agree. And what about now? Now antiretroviral therapies came out, treatments. What now in terms of HIV? Where do you think it stands today in the public consciousness?
Well, so 15 years in, the highly active antiretrovirals have come out. Changes everything, right? It only changes it if you have access to those drugs. So over the next 15 years, the global battle was about access. How do we make these miracle pills available to people around the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where the majority of the cases are? And it took more than a decade to really begin to establish those pipelines to get the medication there, to force the pharmaceutical companies into allowing them to be produced cheaply in generic form and distributed around the globe for under $1 a day. It's really, it's remarkable. It's what these pills have been able to do and accomplish. But that period of activism, that treatment access activism, is, you know, the next chapter in HIV. And that's pretty well, it's done good work. You know, there's probably 20 million people now today who are on antiretrovirals and living near normal lives. That's over half, but that means that there's still, you know, maybe 20 million people who aren't on those pills yet. And so that still requires vigilance and a lot of activism to get there. And I guess the next frontier is, and you must know this, Drew, is AIDS cure. So that's where activism is these days, is pushing for science to continue to research ways that would make that ultimate breakthrough in the research.
And hopefully one day that will happen. We hope.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. And then in amongst this, and just to kind of end this part, as it were, we've still got that kind of, because I believe HIV stigma is still very much there and growing in some senses, and in others, it's not as blatant and as state-led as it has been in the West in the past, but it's still very much there. What's your thoughts on HIV-related stigma?
You know, it's not an area that I've done much work in, Drew. I do know that it's that the stigma in the U.S., although much reduced, it is still a key problem, and it's a key factor in the ongoing, you know, transmission from people who are so stigmatized that their relationship to healthcare has been fraught or broken, and you know, the transmission is still ongoing. It's been a pretty much at the same rate for the last 15 or 20 years in the U.S. and elsewhere, and places where places like the sub-Saharan Africa, where the pandemic is largely heterosexual. It's all wrapped up with the stigma around female sexuality and stigma around you know, marriage norms and the like. And so it really is an area that needs in-depth exploration. And I think that's in part going to be a key player in bringing down the transmission rates.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much agree. And yeah, it's changed and significantly from when it was very state-led in the early days about, you know, watch out for this group of people, be careful of this group of people, which brings me to the nation state for the next part of the discussion. Your recent work, or fairly recent work, Welcome to Chechnya, and absolutely, I have to admit, when I watched it, and we hear these stories at ReportOUT, we get them coming in, but I was really, my jaw dropped when I watched it. I still can't get immune to seeing what's happening in parts of the world, and neither can the rest of our trustees and volunteers. So just for the sake of people in the room who don't know about what's happening in Chechnya right now, could you give us a description of what's happening, who the actors are, what's going on there in terms of LGBTQI plus people?
Absolutely. Chechnya is a republic of Russia, in the south of Russia, in the North Caucasus. It is isolated culturally and geographically. It is home to an ethnic minority, the Chechens. They speak their own language. It's not a very large population. They're mostly Muslim. And there has been a really tense history of tragedy, really, over the last 3 decades in its relationship to the rest of Russia, to Moscow. There have been several wars fought there in the 90s and 2000s that devastated the area. And then Putin, the Russian president, installed a new leadership there, and he's put in power this guy Ramzan Kadyrov, who is allowed to operate on his own whims as long as he does the bidding of Moscow. And one of his whims, which began in early 2017, was this campaign, as he's described it, to cleanse the Chechen bloodline of any queer Chechens. And by that, he literally means a liquidation campaign, right? So he began using his security forces to round up known or suspected gay people, torture them into giving up others, and then either killing them or sending them back to their families with instructions to their families to kill them, in a kind of a so-called honor killing system that he had kind of established there. It's not known how many people have died. Those bodies are not counted. They're not buried in any place where we could really chronicle them. What we do know is that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people have escaped there. Some right ahead of the people who are hunting them, some who escaped the prison cells that they were being held in, or who somehow managed to get away after surviving torture. And those stories started percolating in, I think, April of 2017. And immediately, the queer activists, human rights activists in Russia began setting up a system of safe houses and a rescue strategy for getting people through this kind of underground railroad into these safe houses and then out of the country, because it turns out that Kadyrov and his henchmen were hunting these folks down wherever they went. It wasn't enough to just escape, and isn't enough just to escape. I should say this is still going on. It's in the present tense, because he really has this diabolical belief that you could somehow eradicate queerness by eliminating all the queers. And there's been a lot of international pressure on Russia to do something about this. Russia's not doing anything about it. And that has left it to kind of these ordinary activists in Russia to construct this phenomenal network that has gotten hundreds of people to safety in other parts of the world. And that's the story that I wanted to tell, like my other two films, a story of radical queer activism, and doing the kind of work that I had only read about or seen in movies about the French underground, for example, the French resistance to Nazism and the like. But it's going on today. It's going on today in Europe, and that was phenomenal to me. And the fact that so few people know about it, and again, this is another story of media dereliction, I think, that so little has been exposed about it. That's what drove me to go and ask them, could I embed with them and tell their story?
And an eerie sight for me, which had those words of liquidation, and we want to get rid of all LGBT people before Ramadan, I believe the idea was, and the camps were this odd historical echo. I thought was a very strange thing, that people are being rounded up in camps. And correct me if I'm wrong here, David, but I believe it started predominantly with gay men, and then women afterwards were starting to be drawn in. Am I right in saying?
It's absolutely true that lesbians are harder to find. It's also harder for women to expose themselves to other members of the community. They're under such constraints at home. It's likely that they're not allowed to leave the home, which is the way young women are reared in the Chechen culture. So it makes it a little harder to to find them if you're hunting for them, but not impossible, as we saw in our year of filming. That many women had found themselves being at risk of losing their lives just for identifying as queer.
And so I have to ask this. I'm fascinated. The making of the documentary itself, the access to people, I know you used the deep style technology, which I thought was very clever. What were the difficulties in making something like this in such a hostile zone or area to gain access to people?
Well, people were very nervous about saying yes to me to begin with. And what I had to do is really prove that that I and my team would be able to do this without further endangering anybody. And that meant that we couldn't be seen coming and going from any of the safe houses. We certainly couldn't be seen with, camera crews and the like, and traditional camera equipment. So we really fashioned these security protocols that were very intense and lengthy documents that we would go over each time before we would make a filming expedition. We brought in outside security advisors who worked on our cover stories and what we would say to people we were doing versus what we were actually doing, and how we would be able to accomplish all of that without further endangering anybody. And for the most part, that meant that we didn't shoot outside. And when we did shoot outside, it was with hidden cameras. And there are a couple of scenes where we're actually making a run to airports, for example, or through airports. Those were all done either with hidden GoPros or with cell phones. And we managed to get away without being discovered. We also had to, as you pointed out, I had to promise people that I wouldn't reveal who they were, because if they were just discovered to still be alive, they would be inviting the hunt to continue. And I did that by safeguarding our footage, making sure that it was encrypted to the point where even if I lost control of it, no one would be revealed. And then finally, we had to find a way that I could use those images in the film while still maintaining the anonymity of the individuals. And we did that through you called it a deep fake approach. It was an AI machine learning approach where we were able to replace their faces with the faces of other people. And there are 23 people in the film who are wearing other people's faces. And we did that by recruiting LGBTQ activists, mostly in New York, to come and let us record their face from a million angles and create this massive database for mapping their faces over the contours of the people who allowed us to shoot them. And the result is, I think, allows you to feel and witness the experience that those survivors really bravely allowed me to film, while entirely masking who they are. And so, and I don't want to give away much to people who haven't seen it, but there is a moment in the film where you see how that masking works, and you can see how really transformative, the level of transformation, I guess, is the word I'm looking for, when you do that kind of face swapping.
It was brilliant, and forgive my ignorance with the technological side of it, but for me, it represents a whole new way of being able to go into very sensitive areas, be able to show imagery of people, but obviously change and alter their faces and head. I just thought that opens up, I think, even to human rights defenders like ourselves and like everyone.
Oh, absolutely.
Whole new ways of doing it now, particularly.
Yeah. And with this digital veil, it doesn't impact anything about the way a person is talking. All of their expressions and micro expressions, they're all reflected under this digital veil. So you see the happiness in their face, you see the fear, you see the sadness, um, and that's open to us through this technology.
Absolutely. And so did you receive, what type of critique or criticism did you get from making it? Did you hear anything from the Chechen authorities? Was there any blowback toward the activists who you filmed? How did that all work out?
Well, we worked very closely with the activists in the film to develop an impact campaign around the film that would help them attain the goals that they needed to attain and continue to need to attain. The Kremlin was asked on 2 occasions to comment on the film, and they said that they would not watch it. And Ramzan Kadyrov, the demonic head of Chechnya, has condemned it. He sponsored on Chechen state television a documentary, I think a 35-minute long documentary, condemning me and the film and the stories in the film, and purporting to prove that it was all faked and manufactured. So we know we got their attention. I guess that's what I mean to say. But unfortunately, it has not lifted up the pressure that people live under there. The film came out in early last year, and that's when the curtains of pandemic fell and made it much more dangerous for the people who are trying to get out of Chechnya and were no longer able to travel freely. And so it's created these kind of ongoing and subsidiary problems for the community there.
I think you always know when you've got the attention of a nation state when they sponsor a TV area where they're going to talk about and damn who you are and damn what you do. So bravo for that. Fantastic.
Thank you.
So what I know you talk about the curtains coming down as of the effect of COVID, and we've got some audience questions I want to ask as well, but just got a few more for you if that's okay. Sure. I'm really interested in knowing, within Chechnya, amongst the LGBTQI plus population, where is the resistance? What's happening out there to what the nation state's doing?
Where's the resistance inside Chechnya?
Yeah.
There is almost none. There are very, very quiet collaborators with the larger movement, getting people to safety. But it's not possible to resist openly inside Chechnya. It's just not possible. It would endanger anybody to do that kind of work. Even family members who have come forward and pleaded for any information about what might have happened to their child, who may have been taken on suspicion of being LGBTQ, those people are called in and punished for just having called out for some information. So they're made to apologize directly to Kadyrov for having brought to light the disappearance of their child. So it's one of the most controlled environments I've ever experienced in my life, and there's no wiggle room there. There's really no space to move.
Which is fascinating, because even in some of the most tightly controlled places like Iran, we know of underground movements, we know of underground safe places and things like that, where there genuinely is some movement, there is some activists. And to think that this is so tightly controlled where that can't happen is somewhat scary.
Yeah. Well, it's a very small region, as I said before. It's maybe fewer than 2 million people, and it's clan-based society. So everybody belongs to these big clan families, and the clans are very well organized. So it's a place where there really are no cracks for people to fall through. Everybody is in everybody else's business.
It must be terrifying should your son or daughter disappear and for that then not to be able to be discussed or talked about. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have to ask, what are your plans for the future? Where do you go after Marsha P. Johnson, How to Survive a Plague? I know you've done lots of other work, but just what we've talked about today, and Welcome to Chechnya, where do you go from here? What are you up to now?
Well, I'm finishing up a film now about the pandemic, about this pandemic, which has so many comparisons to the previous HIV pandemic. So we're finishing that up for HBO,
okay.
And then working on a number of other projects.
Brilliant, because one of the audience questions says that, and this is, excuse me, from John, who said, I imagine some journalists have called upon you to link some of the themes, events, community actions, what you wrote about and How to Survive a Plague with the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. Without, obviously, I know you can't give too much away about what you're working on, but what links do you see there, even if they're general? What do you see?
Well, certainly, and you know, we talked earlier about the legacy of HIV/AIDS and activism around that. Really pushed forward the entire field of vaccinology and immunology to the point of really getting it in a place where scientifically we were ready for this new pandemic. The groundwork had been done. The reason the vaccines came out so quickly isn't that they started working on them last January or February. It's that they had been working on vaccines against HIV all these years, against many other coronaviruses, and they just hadn't had an opportunity for success that this one presented to them. And so all the failures in HIV vaccine research really pushed us to the point of being able to respond so quickly on the ground when COVID hit. And it's a lot of the same people, you know, it's a lot of the same researchers that were on the ground in the 80s who are kind of seeing this as a kind of a capstone to their career in research. And that's been really interesting.
Brilliant. Excellent. I'm looking forward to this. That's brilliant. And so what we've seen a lot of at ReportOUT is a lot of nation states and institutions weaponizing COVID-19 against queer people. So we saw this a lot in South Korea, for example, where people were blamed for the outbreak spreading and moving on. We've seen this in other parts of the world as well. For example, in Iran, which is currently going through resurgence of anti-LGBT stamping out and using COVID as a great excuse to do it. There's a whole story to be told here, perhaps, for the future. I think alongside what you're doing now, which I guess leads me to my next question, which is from Phil in the discussion. Would be really interested in hearing about the next queer stories from around the world that you feel need to be told. What would they be?
That's interesting. You know, I don't know. I don't have one in my hands currently. I'm going to ask Bill to write me privately and tell me what I should be looking at. That's what I need. Yeah, I thought of the Chechnya film as being the third in a trilogy of films about this incredible heroics that some members of our community engage in. And I wanted to tell each one of those stories as canonical stories for modern history. That it's not just stories about queers and for the queer community. It's really stories about where queers and queer activism and militancy have changed life and reality for everybody. And so that's what I hope that those three films do together. And I'm always looking for areas where that is true, involving other members of our community.
Brilliant. We might be in contact, David.
Excellent.
So, okay, I think we're starting to wrap up now, everybody. So Unless anybody's got any last minute questions that they'd like to ask. If not, we will. So first of all, I would like to thank everyone who came today, and especially David. Thank you for this. It's been a real honor to meet you personally, and also we need you to keep doing this. We need to keep you to tell these forgotten stories. And so huge bravo to you. I would also like to thank the volunteers who have helped put this together today as well, and all the events team who have been chugging away in the background to get the message out there. And can I just remind people who are here as guests to please, obviously, if you can, drop a donation, sign up to our email list, just check out our website and find out what we do. We are very much a grassroots activist-led organization, and we're spread throughout the world. And so any support is highly appreciated. And also, there will be a feedback survey coming out to your emails if you've signed up for us. Can you please fill it in? We have a response rate of about 50%. Just push it up. So please respond to a wee little survey, please. And we have new events coming up in the new year. So we have events coming up with Jane Ozane, and from the Ozane Foundation, and Bill Busby from Prayway on Netflix, which is going to be talking about the conversion therapy movement. And then we've got an event after that, which is coming up about, and dates haven't been set yet, so little cheeky teasers. We have another event coming up set in Lebanon, where we're going to be looking at what's happening in the Middle East to sexual and gender minorities, particularly Lebanon, which has its own unique history on this one. So again, absolutely fascinating. Thank you, David, very much.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Appreciate all you do.
Brilliant. Thanks. Cheers, folks.